thank you. Thanks for inviting me to present this paper. I'm excited to be here, and we're really welcoming feedback because this is a new paper. So this is joint work with Carolina Lopez, who's a student at Brown University. She's in her 4th year now, and with Simone, Schaner, who's here. All right, let me jump right into it. So we have a lot of evidence from developing countries that there is conditional on visiting a provider, seeing a doctor at a clinic, or visiting any kind of, well, really doctors both in public and private settings, that patients are often overtreated. So there's evidence on malaria treatment in the public sector from Tanzania. Das et al. Have a paper on India where standardized patients visit clinics and get a lot of unnecessary treatment. There's also evidence from China, again with test patients that ask for antibiotics, and a lot of treatment with antibiotics is unnecessary. And there's also some more anecdotal and sort of descriptive evidence that there's widespread overuse of injections in particular, and that they are often, and doctors often attribute this use to patient demand. In our setting, actually, we find that 58% of confirmed malaria-negative patients received an antimalarial. And this, again, is a problem that is pervasive in many other countries, so overtreatment with antimalarials is very common. Overmedication has a lot of potentially negative consequences. It's obviously a waste of resources since you're treating people with an antimalarial when they don't have the parasite. This means a loss of income for poor families, or on the other side, opportunity costs in the public sector if you're putting the cost on the public budget. There's potentially direct harm to overtreatment, which can both harm the patient, him or herself, but also contribute to drug resistance. And then finally, there is at least some potential that over-medication at the intensive margin when you show up at the clinic, which causes a lot of costs, leads people actually to underuse medical care at the extensive margin, meaning they don't go to the doctor because they anticipate it's going to be expensive. So we are looking here at the question, what or actually who drives this overtreatment? So there's obviously the potential that it's coming from doctors and patients alike. They agree that this overtreatment is by their beliefs necessary. And so there's no one driver of this. This is just a sort of collusion situation. But there could also be a disagreement between them. And this is something that we much more often hear about in the literature. Specifically, what you hear in the literature most about is the idea that there is doctor-driven overtreatment, in the sense that healthcare being a credence good, as a patient you cannot confirm if you need the treatment or not, so you have to believe the doctors. But doctors have financial incentives to sell treatments. And they might also find it difficult to diagnose exactly and so on, so there is an incentive to overtreat, and patients basically have no choice but taking the treatment. On the flip side, when you actually ask providers in developing countries, they actually would argue, well, it's the patients who are asking for these treatments. So you hear this often in the context of antibiotics. And there could be many reasons why patients ask for treatment. They could have inaccurate prior beliefs. This might also be because there's a lot of selection into going to the clinic. Only people who really think they are sick go. And there might be some non-medical benefits from treatments. So what all of this requires, though, when you think about patient-driven overtreatment, it has to be that there is some reluctant compliance from doctors, meaning they don't want to treat, but they feel compelled to. There's a question?
So in terms of the second point about the doctor-driven pathway, so financial incentives directly to the doctors, or because there is also sometimes anecdotal evidence that they are sort of in collusion with insurance companies, whereby essentially, there might be. So are you?
So any type of reason that is not medical but financially based could be driving this, right? So here, no insurance really. This is not the issue in Mali where we do this, but this is definitely an issue in other settings. Also, I think what's maybe more relevant here is the question, is this money going directly to the doctor, which would be more the case in private settings. In public settings like ours, it doesn't usually go to the doctor, it goes to the clinic. But the clinics obviously pay ultimately the salaries of the doctor themselves and then the staff and so on. So we think that there is certainly some budget concerns there. So what we do in this paper in a nutshell is we conduct a randomized controlled trial during malaria season on malaria treatment, and we do this in 60 public health clinics. They are called SESCOMs in Bamako in Mali, the capital of Mali. And what we randomize within the clinics, the randomization, the treatments we are focusing on here is an access to a subsidy for malaria ACT tablets. The key difference between our two treatments is that in one case, the patients know that they have access to the subsidy, and we operationalize this by giving them vouchers that we hand directly to the patients. And in the second treatment, they have access to the subsidy, but they don't know about it. We give the vouchers to the doctors, and the doctors can choose at their discretion to reveal that the voucher is available. So the key difference is prices are the same, revenue for the clinic is the same since we reimburse the vouchers. The key difference is that patients know or don't know about this subsidy. And now the key question is that we want to answer with these treatments, is there doctor or patient-driven demand for antimalarials? And the way this experiment teaches us about this is as follows. So there's 3 levels of treatment for malaria. I'm going to say a little more about this later. No treatment, obviously. Simple treatment, which is the simple tablet that we're subsidizing. And then severe treatment, which often involves injections and is much more expensive. Now, if you make the subsidy available, the demand of the patients will change in the obvious way. It will increase demand for simple treatment at the expense of no treatment or severe treatment. So the more expensive thing versus nothing at all. Now, when you give the vouchers to doctors instead, they can choose to reveal or not reveal that the voucher is available. So this means they have an information advantage that they can use to either, if they had different preferences from the patients, to either reduce demand for severe. So they use the vouchers only, reveal them only to people who would demand severe otherwise, so they can reduce treatment to the simple treatment. Or they could use the vouchers only to increase demand for simple treatment, reduce demand for no treatment. So in other ways, they could push patients in the direction they want to go, either more treatment or less treatment. And of course, this would be depending on how they disagree with the patients. So in other words, we would expect the first to occur if there's patient-driven demand for overtreatment, but the second to occur if there's doctor-driven demand for overtreatment. So that's the basic idea behind this design.
The doctors have an unlimited supply of vouchers, or is it a fixed number?
For practical purposes, it's pretty much unlimited. We gave them something like 20, but the intervention officers were at the clinic all day long. So if there had been a shortage, we would have known. Generally, we didn't have as much treatment that this would be an issue. So what do we find? Again, just as a summary, we find that when patients are informed about the subsidy, they use more vouchers and they are prescribed and buy more antimalarials. And this is driven entirely by patients with low malaria risk. So people substitute out of no treatment into simple treatment more. When we give the vouchers to doctors or patients, in both cases, there is the same decrease in demand, or in fact, as we find a slightly stronger decrease in demand for severe treatment. And this is driven by patients, as you would expect, with high malaria risk. And then finally, question?
No, sorry, go ahead. I'll ask you a point.
And then finally, in order to check in some ways what might be driving these effects, we also look at cost and revenue for clinics, and we find no evidence whatsoever that that doctors use their information advantage to increase their revenue from selling these treatments. And we find actually that sort of as supporting evidence that when the patients know about vouchers, we have a little bit more cheating in the sense that more patients use the voucher for severe treatment. And we also found that doctors withhold the vouchers occasionally, even when they say when they sell simple treatments in the doctor voucher treatment. And we can show, and I'll talk more about this, we can show that this is also an evidence for overtreatment, patient-driven overtreatment. So overall, we find that there's really strong evidence for patient-driven demand in this setting.
Sorry, one question on the first point. So if I understand correctly, here we are talking about pills.
Yeah.
But so isn't it possible that they take the pills, but actually they don't take them and they just store them for later use?
That is possible. We don't find any evidence for that because we do a home survey. Let me get to this. Let me answer this when we get there.
Just another small point. On the point 3, so actually there's a graduate student of mine who's now in Africa, actually, but his dramatic paper was finding something consistent with that, and he was working with pharmacists in Ghana, and was actually finding that the mistakes they were making was sort of not due to profit motives.
Okay.
I can give you
So so that's interesting, and we should look more into this. There's certainly the evidence from the antibiotics paper, the Lee et al. Paper, and they find, or Curry and Lee, I think it is, and they find that that doctors react very strongly to the patient stating that they want to buy the medication in the clinic versus someplace else, which suggests, again, financial motives. But yeah, there's sort of mixed evidence on these, I guess. Okay, so to give you an outline, this outline is mainly here to point to the fact that I'm going to talk about the experimental design and data collection in detail only a little bit later. So I want you to hold off on questions a little bit until we get there. But I'm going to give some background information and talk about our conceptual framework, and then give the details on the design, main results, and then conclude. All right, so malaria in Mali. Mali is a poor country, and malaria is a leading cause of death still, 20% of all deaths in 2016. And malaria treatment policy has changed a little bit over the last decade or so, in particular in response to increasing parasite resistance to treatment. So an important component of the malaria treatment policy is that you should only treat after a positive malaria test so the patient is a confirmed malaria patient. And then in about 90% of cases estimated, the appropriate treatment is simple treatment, which is a simple artemisinin combination therapy or ACT pill. And in about 10% of estimated cases, the patient needs severe treatment. So this is sort of a crisis state of malaria. This is when malaria has gone untreated. It's a life-threatening emergency, meaning you need an injection. The treatment needs to go into the bloodstream immediately. And then you follow up with ACT as well. And the symptoms of severe malaria are, this is really an emergency. You might be in a coma or unconscious. There's convulsions, seizures, respiratory failure, and so on. So where we are doing this study is in a big city, Bamako. And so malaria prevalence is lower than in the rest of the country. It's only about 6% of children, in fact, from the DHS data.
So just clarification, you need the severe treatment when you waited too long.
So it can sometimes escalate really, really quickly. So severe treatment is really an indication of having a huge amount of a high parasite load. So actually, in fact, sometimes in more endemic areas, severe is less common because people become more resistant to the parasite themselves. But generally, it's a sign of, when I say untreated, it can happen within 24 hours. It depends on how you respond and how quickly the parasite multiplies. So, but most cases, the only thing that I want to point out is that most cases really are not severe. And if they are, you are in a severe state of crisis and you need hospital referrals. So you only do a first emergency treatment, and then you normally get this person into an ICU. So malaria prevalence is actually surprisingly low in our setting in the urban areas that we're looking at. But we are looking at these community clinics, SESCOMs, and these are really the primary source of care for our sample. 72% of parents seek care for children in the public sector, and of those 47% go actually to one of these SESCOMs. And in this setting, this is this community clinic setting where user fees support the clinic. So they don't go directly to the doctor, as to your point, but they do go to the clinic budget and help pay the salaries and so on. And the clinics that we are looking at are all headed by a doctor and have a small pharmacy right in the building. And they also typically have malaria testing capability. Either they have access to these rapid detection tests, or they have a small lab. And then, although doctor absences are common, 24% of cases, stockouts are actually fairly rare. So there is medication available, and there's typically a trained nurse or a doctor in the clinic. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to tell you more about the data, but we essentially do intake interviews and follow-up visits. So we test patients at home if they have malaria. So we have a positive RDT, or we have an RDT test for 55% of our sample. And here you can see that of all the patients that we see, 47% receive malaria treatment. And of all the patients we tested at home with a negative test, 42% received malaria treatment, almost half of them severe treatment. And when you look at the malaria positive cases, only 53% received severe treatment. So as I mentioned, the assumption is that about 10% of these cases at most should be severe cases. And you can also see when you look at the positive testing rate, only about 25% of patients tested at home actually had malaria. And when you then look at the comparison between prescription rates and purchasing rates, prescription rates are actually even higher. So 60% of the sample were prescribed malaria treatment, but the patients don't always buy that, and we know that they typically turn it down because not because there was a stock out or anything like that, but the patients actually decide not to buy. So cost of treatment is pretty dramatic.
So just to clarify, so you get tested and you turn out to be negative, and it's the doctor's decision to still give you the severe treatment?
So we don't know what the doctors do exactly. We can ask if they did a test, but we don't know what the result was. We cannot check that. We can only we do an RDT, a rapid detection test at home when we see the patients in a follow-up visit. We do this for 55% of patients, and then we can tell if they actually have malaria or not. And the reason that we can tell is that the test is an antigen test. So even if you were treated, you would still have the antigens in your blood. We do this normally on the next day after the patient was at the clinic. So what the doctor diagnoses, we don't know. We can only see what we know for sure that 25% of the sample were tested positive by us. So when you look at costs, and we just look at, in the control group, at people who had these different treatment options and bought them, you can see that the cost increase between especially simple treatment and severe treatment is quite dramatic. So this is in CFA, but when you translate this into dollar, this is the severe treatment costs about $17 US, and this is 47% of the per capita monthly income of our sample. And so all of these really point to at least the potential for doctor overtreatment, right? Patients don't always buy what they are prescribed, so they seem to suspect something about that this is overtreatment. There's huge rates of overtreatment, and you can also see that the prices would, if you had a budget motive, if you had a revenue motive, the doctors might want to sell the severe treatment. But then on the flip side, we also have some evidence that patients play a role here. Because when we ask patients before the clinic consultation what they have, 55% of patients believe to have malaria, and many of them name only malaria as the potential illness that they might have. And 57% of the health workers in our sample report pressure to prescribe unnecessary treatments, and many of them name malaria specifically. So overall, from this descriptive data, there's potential for both patient and doctor-driven overtreatment.
Is it not the case that if you have the malaria treatment, you're actually not going to get malaria later because you're already treated? So I don't
Yes, so there is a certain prophylactic effect as well.
So isn't that a good thing? Like if you get treated, you can potentially and when that would happen in those areas, I mean, it's just a precautionary.
So the WHO recommendation is not to do that. So there is prophylactic treatments, and there is prophylaxis via bed nets and treating bed nets to prevent mosquito bites. But using actual acute treatment and ACTs for preventive treatment is not the right thing to do, at least from a medical standpoint. From an individual standpoint, it might be, because your private benefits are higher than the social costs.
And I mean, it also depends on the alternatives, right? If the alternatives are more expensive, or you have to continue doing that, this is one-time thing. I mean, I'm from Pakistan, so I would just go with that option, like just get over-treatment, and then I'm good.
Yeah, exactly. This is what these patients probably do. Exactly.
It's actually rational, right?
It's not necessarily irrational, that's true, yeah. So the patients might have this preference. This is exactly what we're trying to look for, right? Patients might have a preference for, just better safe than sorry. I'm willing to spend this money to avoid even the potential of malaria. It's possible. But it's not medically not what should be done, and it has huge social costs in the form of resistant parasites that are becoming more and more of a problem for malaria.
I don't think it's a good idea basis, I think it's pretty bad for your liver.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot keep taking.
Yeah, so this is also true. I mean, you're saying this one-off thing, yes, you take it once, but it stays in your bloodstream for a certain amount of time. It's obviously not giving you prophylaxis for the rest of the malaria season or something like that.
That's where I thought it's like one thing, you take it for life and then you
No,
know,
it's like
No, it's not a vaccine. It's treatment.
All life.
Okay.
No, it's not a vaccine. It's just a treatment, and it kills the parasite, but that's it.
Okay, got that.
So these ACTs can be stored? Can they
Yes, they can be stored. Yes.
I mean, in terms of efficiency, you know, if these get do they have to travel, like, to walk kilometers to get to the clinic? Like, in terms of
Not in our
efficiency?
setting. I mean, in some settings in rural Mali, certainly yes. Not in our setting. There's 60 clinics in the city. It's a 1.2 million people.
In general, just, you know, if you want to talk about the efficiency of these, like, if it's bad or good, it may be that, you know, storing a few extra pills is good if there are such costs.
Yeah, if they were storing them, yes, but we don't see any of that in the data. Okay, so let me talk about the framework. Okay, so I'm a bit behind on time now, but the simplest version of this model is one where people have a certain perceived malaria risks based on their symptoms, and we are assuming for simplicity that this is an observed thing, so the doctors know what the patients are believing. We are relaxing this later. The treatment costs P, and the simple treatment can be either zero price when you have a voucher or price P. And the net benefit from treatment, either severe V or simple L, is the probability of having malaria times this benefit minus the cost of treatment. And this could include non-monetary costs, for example, the effort and the hassle and the side effects. But all of this, what this does for us is really just that if we have that the cost ratio is greater than the benefit ratio, as the risk of malaria goes up, as your symptoms become stronger, you prefer first no treatment, then simple treatment, then severe treatment. So in graphical form, it looks like this. This is the net benefit from simple treatment and the net benefit from severe treatment. And here you prefer no treatment at all because both give you negative benefit. Then you prefer simple treatment, and then as severe treatment gets more attractive, you prefer severe treatment. So you're generating these three areas here. And now if you lower the price of treatment by the voucher, the net benefit of simple treatment goes up, and as a consequence, you have the substitution from no treatment and severe treatment into simple treatment. Now, doctors might differ from patients, and this whole slide is really only to say that they differ from patients for various reasons. First of all, there is a medical cost-benefit trade-off that might be different from the private patient's trade-off, and this includes these social spillovers and treatment externalities. We also believe that doctors do care to some degree about patient utility, meaning they are altruistic, so we allow for an altruism parameter in here. And then finally, as we said before, the clinic revenue, or in other words, the price that the patient actually hands over to the doctor might matter for them. So we get a utility function, and here we are, for simplicity, lumping all differences in the medical or versus patient private cost-benefit trade-off into the cost. But all this is to say really is that doctors might have different belief cutoffs for when they prefer no versus simple versus severe treatment. And these cutoffs, depending on what these weights are, might be either below or above what the patients prefer.
There may be reputation costs for the doctors, for instance, if they come to be known as sort of, or benefits, whatever. Would there be anything like that?
Yes. So there is a second component, and this is now where, so think of this doctor-patient situation, right? The idea that patients can actually make you overtreat, you need to have some kind of cost to not treating them when they want to be treated. And so this is exactly what we are assuming here. We are assuming that in addition, doctors might experience costs of deviating from patient preferences. There's first of all the normal cost, which is the inability to sell to patients who don't really believe you that they need the treatment. But then how can patients pressure you to sell, to prescribe more than what you wanted to prescribe? Well, we assume that there has to be some gatekeeping cost, we call it G, if the patient does not receive his or her most preferred treatment. And this could be direct conflict, but this could also be the loss of a customer in the future, or a lower probability on the patient side of following instructions. And it could be including this reputation effect. So as a result, doctors have these uninternalized patient preferences, but they take them into account via these gatekeeping costs. And now, what is the effect of giving vouchers to patients versus doctors, as I described in the beginning? Well, the intuition is that in the doctor voucher treatment, the doctor can selectively reveal the discounts and therefore move the outcomes closer to their own intrinsic preferences and overcome these gatekeeping cost problems. So, just as an example, suppose the doctor tried to minimize treatment demand. What they would do is actually conceal the voucher to all the patients who at the high price prefer no treatment, and then only reveal the voucher and increase demand for all the patients who prefer simple or severe, and thereby moving a lot of people from severe treatment to simple treatment. So in other words, bringing them down to a lower level of treatments. And you can make the same argument for maximizing treatment demand, but I'm going to skip this for time. So in summary, our predictions are, if doctors and patients have the same preferences or there's no gatekeeping costs, then there should be no difference between patient voucher and doctor voucher treatment. But if gatekeeping costs actually matter, then voucher use would generally be lower in the doctor voucher treatment and in the patient voucher treatments, because the doctors use the vouchers only when they feel they are needed. And if patients are driving the overtreatment, then the share of patients receiving no antimalarial should be higher in DV versus PV, and this should be driven by low malaria patients. But if doctors drive overtreatment, then the share of patients receiving severe treatment should be higher in DV than PV, and it should be driven by higher malaria risk patients. And then in addition, if doctors prioritize revenue, just for the intuition here, we would assume that they use their information advantage and they use the price reduction to increase sales as much as possible. So we would expect highest revenue in DV versus PV, and then the lowest revenue in the control.
Maybe test one indication of this idea that you may prescribe something because you are afraid of losing the customers to exploit distance from other clinics.
Sorry, say that again.
So maybe you are more likely to overprescribe if there is another clinic nearby, if you are worried about losing the customer. So I don't know, this is something maybe you can test.
So yeah, I'm not sure exactly if we could do this in our setting, because these clinics are really relatively. We can look into this. We could look into this.
Yeah,
if there's some, so it gets a little bit complicated since we are doing this as a within clinic randomization, and what will happen is fixed effects. I mean, the clinics are quite, there's a lot of heterogeneity, so I'd be worried about that, about power in this setting, but we could think about that. So just as a short outlook on what we do with the model in addition, so in a more general model, there's uncertainty about patient preferences, so the doctor doesn't know exactly what kind of patient they are facing, so they can target their voucher use as precisely. And we know that doctors don't know exactly what preferences their patients have simply from the fact that they don't always buy what is prescribed to them. So in that case, a few interesting predictions come out of it, but I want to just highlight one, and that is that if patients drive over treatment, then in this uncertain setting, you might have a situation where doctors actually prescribe the simple treatment but don't use the voucher, and they do so more often in DV versus PV. And the intuition behind this is that you don't know exactly what patient you're facing. So you might be either facing a patient who's really rabid about this treatment, right? They really want the simple treatment. And for those, you want to prescribe the simple treatment just so you don't face the gatekeeping costs. But then at the same time, the patient might be someone who wasn't actually willing to buy the treatment at the high costs. So in order to avoid substitution from those patients from no treatment to some treatment, you actually don't reveal the lower price. So this is a situation that you only get if you have this type of uncertainty where this is an optimal course of action. Prescribing simple, but not using this discount that you have available. And the reason is that you want to keep some patients from buying, so it has to be a patient-driven overtreatment situation.
Do you worry about experimenter demand effects on the doctor side, that they want to appear as if they're not getting people into the severe treatment for profit reasons?
Yes, but then we should see this in both the PV and the DV because the setup is almost exactly identical except for this difference on who gets the voucher. So yes, I think this is very much an out of equilibrium thing, right? We cannot claim that this is a partial equilibrium. We change the price on only 1 day or 2 days for each clinic. And it's a very short-lived thing. And the reason was exactly that we didn't want to trigger general equilibrium effects where different kinds of patients come to the clinic and so on. But as a result, we cannot really say what would happen in the long run or what would happen if no experiment was occurring. We are only using this as a test for the presence of patient-driven overtreatment. Okay, so we have 60 clinics in the capital. Prior to the intervention, we trained all the doctors on the basics of malaria treatment, and the reason is partly for ethical reasons, but also we wanted everyone to be on the same page, what is actually the policy. And then we have a 2-week observation period with 6 days of intervention, with 6 days of observation, and then we vary the experimental conditions day by day within clinic, meaning we have for each treatment 2 days of treatment. And the idea behind this within treatment was exactly that we wanted to minimize any kind of change in the composition of patients. We wanted to do this as much as possible on the intensive margin. So we have these 2 versions of this is our treatment. We have the 2 versions of this ACT voucher. Patient vouchers are given directly to patients when checking into the clinic, and they are explained what this voucher is for. And doctor vouchers, where doctors are given a supply of these vouchers beforehand, and patients are not informed of their availability. And all these vouchers can be redeemed at the clinic pharmacy, and in the evening of the same day, the pharmacy is reimbursed for all the vouchers that they gave out to hold the financial incentives constant.
Sorry, day by day means you have days during which everyone, in a given day, everyone in the clinic gets the same treatment.
Exactly. So when they come in, they are all either, so we have actually different intervention officers who do these, so they are at the clinic for the day and they give the same treatment to everyone. So the vouchers are only valid for simple malaria treatment and they require a signature. And the intervention officers inform doctors only in the morning of the visit what intervention day they were in. And the intervention officers also stayed at the clinic and checked the names of the patients on each voucher and checked actually what they received at the pharmacy in exchange for the voucher. We also have some other treatments which I'm omitting. And then we have 3 sources of data. The first is a clinic survey where we do an intake survey when patients come in and have acute symptoms. We record their symptoms, any medication prescriptions, we do this before and after the visit. So after the visit, we ask for prescriptions and purchases, any reasons for not purchasing, any tests performed, and the costs. We have administrative data on our own side on the voucher redemptions. And then finally, we choose a subsample of our patients to visit at home the next day. And then we do additional questions on if they are taking the treatment to look for stockouts. To look for stocking or storing the medication, and we do an RDT test to determine true malaria status.
So in the doctor voucher, do they think that there's some scarcity in the system? Like, are they given a finite number of vouchers?
So they are given a finite number, just, we print a bunch and then they take them to the clinic. But in practice, they got about 25 vouchers, and the average number of patients for malaria is 5 in each clinic per day. Having said that, maybe they were worried about this, but these IOs, the intervention officers, were also there. So if they had run out of vouchers, they could have been restocked.
Did you look at changes over time of the treatment effect? Because I can imagine that at first, because essentially what happens is that there is a weighting of whether you as a doctor know about the discount. I mean, you know today, but tomorrow the discount isn't there anymore because you randomize that. So I mean, in principle, you can imagine that the way doctors will decide whether they actually want to inform the patient or not will depend on how long this cycle has been going on. There could be learning.
Yes, there could be. So again, we do only 2 treatments of each per clinic, 2 days. So we have a total of 6 visit days for every clinic over 2 weeks. So there is so we actually did a few robustness checks and looking at sort of over time effects. We were more worried about Hawthorne effects, exactly what you were asking about, I think. The fact that doctors might feel compelled to behave better when we are watching them. And and we don't find much there, but we find that the effects are a little stronger in the later days, which is exactly what could be explained maybe by a Hawthorne effect. So yes, does this answer your question?
Just Anja, so in your model you don't have this idea that the treatment is temporary and you know it's 2 days and now you've got this super good price and tomorrow is going to be expensive again. So in this case, I mean the storing, at least the fact that, so you say that you're going to rule out the storing behavior with surveys, right?
So we do ask afterwards if they take the treatment, and over 95% of people take the treatment that they were prescribed. Having said that, I think this is a concern, right? There is sort of this one-off opportunity to get, so again, I think we should think of this as, it's still patient-driven demand because the patients are sort of like, oh my God, I need to get this.
Except if it was 1 month, it would be maybe lower.
It could be lower because people know now that they can get it anytime. Right. That's true. So again, this is totally, we are out of equilibrium. It's a partial equilibrium effect. I think you're right that this might be true. But generally, if the doctors are good gatekeepers, even if it was true, they shouldn't respond to this type of demand from patients, right? This is kind of their whole function. The reason why we ask people or why some medications are prescription medication is precisely so that the doctors don't give it out to everyone, including those who don't have it. So in some sense, you could argue the doctors should hold against that. But okay, so the core regression specification is that we have the 2 treatment indicators here. We have time fixed effects and so this is within clinic. So we have the 2 treatment indicators. Sorry, lost my train of thought here. And we're testing for patient-driven demand by looking at the 2 coefficients on the 2 treatments here. And in addition, we are checking for heterogeneity by observable malaria risk by using our home-based sample and predicting the potential for malaria in the patient based on symptoms using a probit estimation. So here's our balance table. It's worth focusing on this column here. This is the p-value for patient voucher versus doctor voucher having the same coefficient. And you can see there's very little differences. However, it is true that there is potentially, even with our only 1-day treatments, there's a little bit of an effect of the voucher treatments. And you see this here, the number of eligible logged patients on that day in the clinic is slightly higher. But, and you see this also in this test here, but it's actually higher in both the patient voucher and the doctor voucher, and the 2 treatments have the same effect. You also see a little bit of this effect here in the age. So there is a little bit of more patients coming in or more patients being surveyed on these voucher days, but what's most important is that there is no difference between PV and DV days. Okay, so what do we find? First of all, when we look at the use of vouchers between patient voucher and doctor voucher, you see this huge effect, of course. There's no use in the control days, but then the patient voucher use is much higher than the doctor voucher use, and the difference is highly significant, which is our test for gatekeeping costs. So clearly doctors experience pressure from patients in some way or other. Now the question is, which direction does this pressure go? Well, this is what these 2 tests are for. So we would expect that there is pressure from the patient side if there is this difference in the no malaria treatment, and this is exactly what we find. So you see here that the prescription rates are for no malaria treatment, so the prescription of malaria treatment is much higher in the patient voucher than the doctor voucher treatment, and this difference also translates through into the purchases of malaria treatment, and this is again highly significant both with the 2-sided and the appropriate 1-sided test. But then when we look at severe treatment, so this is the substitution out of severe into simple, and remember we would expect if doctors are pushing patients to buy, we would see a difference there. And here we really see no difference. And in particular, what we see is in fact that the doctor voucher effect, the substitution out of severe into simple, is stronger when the doctors receive the vouchers than when the patients receive the vouchers. So the 1-sided test again is not significant here. So what this is a first indicator for is that this is, there is gatekeeping costs and there's patient-driven demand.
So if I understand correctly, so the same clinic would 1 day get the patient voucher and 1 day get the DV, right?
Mm-hmm.
And would the patients have any way of knowing that, their doctors at some point, they don't know exactly when, but they know at some point in the week their doctors would get these vouchers? I'm just wondering whether on the days that there is a DV, if the patients know that this is a week in which at some point the doctors would also get vouchers, they're also sort of they're pressurizing their doctors as well.
So if this was the case, then certainly this could potentially be the case. I don't want to make the claim. So my general impression is that information channels, informal information channels work pretty well. And we do see this increase in patients, right, on both these days. So I wouldn't want to make this argument, but it does seem that what you're describing would just make this difference smaller, right? Because you would get the same pressure on the DV days, and yet we see this large difference. So maybe this is a lower bound for the effect that we see.
Yeah, but it does speak a little bit about the mechanism as to what is happening. I think it goes in your favor. It's just that the separation of the two treatments then, in some sense, becomes a little less.
Yeah, so we can't fully rule it out. We did whatever we could to rule it out, but we cannot completely prevent that.
So, trying to think about other reasons why the patient voucher might have more effect on no malaria treatment than doctor voucher. Is there any, when doctors are prescribing, do you think they take into account the probability that the patient will comply if prescribed? You know, in other words, would doctors be more likely to prescribe if they got a signal that the patient was going to be a compliant patient? You know, and that, you know, if that's true, then like patient asking for the medication may be a signal like that. You know, may provide that signal.
Okay.
And then sort of, you know, the voucher leads the patient to mention, you know, treatment, you know, the pill treatment, and the doctor takes that as a signal this is a compliant patient, so there's going to be greater return to prescribing for this patient. You know, it's sort of like different mechanism than what you're imagining.
Yeah, so first of all, I think in principle, yes. I think this might be something that doctors take into account because you feel kind of like it's a waste of resources if you, and they do have stockouts, right? You don't want to give it to someone who's then just throwing it out.
Yeah.
I think the real margin of non-compliance in this particular case is actually if people buy the medication or not. It does seem, well, this is something that doctors cannot know for sure, just like, you know, they can't know what patients do at home for sure. But we do see that they take it when they have bought the medication. The real margin of non-compliance is that they don't buy what's being prescribed. And that is something the doctors can already observe. So they know they know that when they make prescriptions, the pharmacy is right there, it's attached, and they are directly working together, so they know how much of the treatment the patients are actually getting. And it should be said that these public pharmacies are subsidized compared to private pharmacies, so if you get the prescription there, you would probably want to go to this pharmacy and buy it there. So about 30% of patients don't actually buy the prescribed malaria treatment, and to that extent, the doctors know there is some potential for, you know, not.
I'm just saying, even in that context that you just described, you could just, if you somehow knew that the patient wasn't, if you're on the, you know, margin of prescribing or not to a patient, you might still prescribe more if you thought the patient was sending a signal that they were going to go and buy the pill, you know, 5 minutes later.
Right, and
literally
right, but giving them the free vouchers does increase. So it could be that they don't know that yet when they give out the vouchers. The doctors, so there is a potential for that, I guess. If they give out the voucher in the doctor voucher treatment, they don't have the signal if this patient is then going to take the voucher and take it to the pharmacy. They do. We find that they do, but of course the doctor might not know this. But then at least there is no such motive as the medication is wasted on this person because they don't even buy it. So some of that could come in for sure, but I think it's second order to this idea that you have potentially this unpleasant experience of a patient either they don't come back to you or they complain about what they are being prescribed. So we cannot rule out that we cannot fully rule that out, I guess.
You can't rule that out directly, but it sounds like you need to argue that unlikely to be a big deal. This thing that I'm saying. Yeah, so I guess this is what I'm trying to say, right? I think the doctors observe non-compliance on the margin of buying versus not buying before and after, so they can see if the patients buy when they get the doctor voucher. But then on the at-home margin, we know, and I don't know if the doctors know this or not, but we know that all the patients are actually taking the treatment that they are getting.
So to that degree, if that's a worry, then they would be out of equilibrium if they believe patients don't take the treatment. So that's what we could argue. So so just to follow up on the where is this margin of shifting happening? Where is the substitution happening? So when we look at voucher use, you can see again that voucher use increases both for high and for low malaria risk patients, but the difference is really mostly in the below median malaria risk group in terms of the differential use in patient and doctor voucher treatment, and this is consistent with the idea that when you look at severe treatment, both doctors and patients are, doctors do not switch out of severe less than patients. In fact, they switch out of severe more and use the simple treatment vouchers for these patients. And consequently, the one-sided test does not show a difference. Versus when you look at the no treatment substitution, you can see that in the below median malaria risk, this is where all the vouchers are being used, and they are used much more in the patient voucher than the doctor voucher treatment, so that we see this big difference between PV and DV, meaning that really there is the substitution from no treatment to treatment driven by patient demand.
So can you repeat the patient vouchers are given to the patients when they check into the clinic?
Yeah.
But that's before any diagnosis, right? Like before being told they have malaria. So I was wondering, is it a possibility that maybe being given these vouchers to patients, they get more scared, like they may get more aware of the possibility to really have malaria, like it reinforces their beliefs of malaria and therefore they push more, you know? Could that be a mechanism? Like,
it could be. So these intervention vouchers obviously do no diagnosis whatsoever. They just hand out the voucher and they say, if the doctor signs off on this and diagnoses malaria for you, you get the treatment for free.
But it could be a signal. You
It
know,
could
like
be a
malaria is really a big deal here. These people are worried about malaria. That's why they're subsidizing malaria treatments. And I really might have malaria, you know, even before I had some doubts and, you know, just make me more pushy about having these treatments.
Yeah, so of course we cannot fully, that's true, we could not fully rule this out. We ask patients, so the surveyors and the intervention officers are separate, and the surveyors ask people for their beliefs about malaria, so we could actually check if that has an effect. So that's something we should do.
To any patient, you know, or just to the ones that said, I believe I have malaria.
No, they give it to all patients. The intervention is completely separate from the survey, but in the survey we ask for beliefs, and to the extent that the vouchers were given before the survey, which is not always the case because they were separate. But if that happened, then we should see an increase in belief of malaria for patients who got the vouchers. So we could check that. Actually,
it's
good
kind of
point.
an interesting point that, like, you know, just giving a voucher like this may lead the patient to reveal information in the doctor visit that leads to a diagnosis that they wouldn't have thought to reveal.
Yeah, something like that.
Prior.
I
I mean,
mean,
like,
your response to the voucher.
yeah, you give someone a voucher for an HIV test, and maybe they, I don't know, or you know, any other unrelated, some other sort of medical condition, and then they may reveal information that may remind them or prod them to reveal information about that condition that they didn't come into the clinic for initially, or.
Okay, so the nice thing about malaria, unlike with many other like antibiotics use, is, for example, a problem we can never really test for this because there is no good test if you have a bacterial infection. For malaria, there is a good test, right? So the doctors can, no matter what the patient reveals to them, they could conduct a test and should, based on that, know if the patient has malaria or not. In practice, that's not what's happening, but just as in terms of sort of how much objective information is available, the test is available to all of these. So, but it's true. It could be that the patients start overstating their. But you know, if you think of this almost. We discussed this in the paper a little bit. We think of this almost as patient-driven demand, right? If you start emphasizing that you feel really like you have malaria because you got the voucher and you now think you want. This is a form of patient-driven demand.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So we think of this as almost the same. It's a little bit of a different. It's a signaling type problem.
Oh, you're right.
And in equilibrium, in a full equilibrium, you would actually not believe that patient because you understand that they have this incentive. But of course, in this partial equilibrium, it could happen. So it's almost a form of patient-driven demand as well. It's just this patient emphasizing more that they want this thing that you're selling. So 10 minutes. So just a quick result. We also So when you have access to these vouchers and when you have access to the vouchers without the patient's knowledge, that should give you an information advantage you can use to make money, either to sell as much severe as before but more simple, or possibly if simple is the thing that gives you the highest revenue, to sell more simple. But we really find no effects whatsoever, and in fact, if anything, we find a little bit of a negative effect of the doctor voucher treatment on patient cost and revenue, and this is because the doctors switch the patients out of severe treatment more.
And that the revenue includes the voucher amount?
Yes, this includes the whole. Revenue is the voucher amount, and the cost to patients is, of course, when they get subsidized. And now, I'm just going to state this without showing you, the doctors also prescribe more simple without a voucher in DV versus PV, which is something that in the uncertain model is predicted for a patient-driven demand. But this might alert you to the fact that there could be an alternative explanation for all of this. And this is simply that the doctors forget to hand out the vouchers occasionally, right? It could be that there is no gatekeeping costs or whatever. It's just that the doctors put these vouchers in a stack on the side and don't look at them again. And this is kind of the story that you were telling as well a little bit. When the patients come in with a voucher, the patients basically do the job of reminding them that this discount is available. However, what speaks against this is actually our results on severe malaria. So when you have this type of situation where they just sometimes forget, then you would see less of a use of this discount, both for simple treatment and on the no and simple margin and on the severe margin. But we see this really strong substitution out of severe into simple. And in some ways, if you were to just think that some doctors act as if they are in the control and some act as if they are in the patient voucher treatment, it should be that DV is just a convex combination of the two, but this is not true for the severe treatment results. There, the result is actually stronger in DV than in both PV and control. And here's another piece of evidence that there is likely patient-driven demand, and this is actually bending the rules. So we did what we could to prevent this type of thing. But what happens, why do we actually see this larger decrease in severe treatment in DV than in PV? Well, what we found is actually that sometimes in the patient voucher treatment, the doctors use the vouchers for severe treatment. So they give out they give out the voucher and give free treatment, but this is actually a treatment that is associated with severe. And you see that this is almost never happening in the doctor voucher treatment, but it is happening to some degree, to a significant degree in the patient voucher setting. And we tried to stop this as much as we could, but occasionally they slipped through and they got the severe treatment while getting the discount as well, which was, of course, against the rules of the voucher. So again, this speaks anecdotally, that speaks for the fact that the patients pressure these doctors to give them what they want. So now, as a last question, what's my time? 5 minutes, okay. So as a last question, we wanted to know what the welfare effects of this are. And we have these 55% of people we tested at home, but as we show in the paper, there is some selection into testing. So people could refuse the test and some people did. And we find that people who took the test are significantly sicker, have more symptoms than people who didn't take the test. So what we're doing here is we're focusing on predicted malaria positivity instead. And we are using a measure of a good outcome to be the predicted probability of having malaria times the fact if you're taking an anti-malarial or not. And then as a negative outcome, probability of not having malaria times a good outcome in the case of negative, so a correct negative, 1 minus taking the anti-malarial, and then the expected match, which would be giving equal welfare weights to both of those, which maybe you don't want to do, but we could do it by just adding up MPI and MNI. And here's what we find. So we see a big improvement in malaria positive matches. So more people who have malaria take malaria treatments. And this is both true for prescribed and purchased. And we see it both in patient voucher and doctor voucher. But then when you look at malaria negative matches, so over treatment, you see this big decrease. You see this big worsening in the patient voucher treatment. And you see it more also on the purchase margin. And we find that there is this significant difference, again, between patient voucher and doctor voucher, meaning when the patients get access to the subsidy, they worsen the match between treatment and disease. And this is entirely driven by overtreatment. So in summary, doctors treat patients more for malaria when the patients know about an available subsidy. This is driven by higher treatment for patients at low risk for malaria. There is actually a greater reallocation of treatment from severe to simple for patients with high risk for malaria under DV, and doctors use the vouchers more for both simple and severe treatment under the patient voucher treatment. And the revenue motive really doesn't seem to be what's driving this difference. Revenue and cost effects are in fact, and if anything, negative under the doctor voucher treatment, and all of this is driven by the high malaria risk consistent with switching out from severe expensive treatment to cheaper simple treatment. So what this shows is that patients demand malaria over treatment, and they are not as price sensitive as you might think. So even at high prices, they have a demand for it. They demand severe, for example, even if in some cases when the low price simple treatment is available. The doctors do disagree with patients in their preferences, but they don't disagree for revenue reasons, but more for medical reasons. So they understand that not all of these patients need treatment. They fail their gatekeeping function if the patients pressure them against their own preferences, but when they can, they strategically control price information to reduce treatment rates. And what this means is this has consequences for how we think about public care delivery, right? Because the standard idea is that doctors try to get patients to overtreat for revenue reasons, and therefore there's actually a lot of discussion of interventions that increase patient agency, give patients more information, help patients understand what treatments they need. But what we here actually would want in this situation where patients are pushing for treatment, we would interventions that reduce the gatekeeping costs for doctors, that in fact reduce patients pushing against what doctors want. And in fact, you could argue that we want in some cases actually policies that decrease the agency of the patient and the influence on the patient of what's being prescribed to them. And this is probably contrary to what many sort of conventional interventions would be, that try to reduce overtreatment on the basis of the idea that doctors overtreat because of this credence good problem.
Do you have a sense of, at least for the case of malaria, how much of the overtreatment takes place at a clinic versus, say, pharmacies? Because in pharmacies, pharmacies don't have the gatekeeping cost, or at least it's way lower than for doctors, right?
So pharmacies, I'm not sure exactly so pharmacies by national malaria policy would also be obligated to only sell the treatment if they do a test. But I'm actually not sure if they do this. You can definitely walk into a Malian pharmacy and buy malaria treatment, and you don't have to do a test. It's way more expensive at a private pharmacy than it is at these public provision points. And all public provision happens through these clinics. So, but I'm not actually sure, I'm not sure what you mean by the gatekeeping costs are lower at pharmacies, actually. What do you mean by that?
I mean, the doctor probably cares about the spillovers, the social benefit, and so on. For the pharmacies, they just have profit motive.
I mean, just as with doctors, these pharmacists are obviously trained in the same way as the doctors are. They are trained, in order to have a licensed pharmacy, you have to be a trained pharmacist. Having said that, there's a lot of sales points that are not pharmacies that probably also sell this at. So generally the only reason why this is not so relevant for the sample is that the costs are so much higher at these.
I'm not thinking about your sample, but thinking more broadly about.
Yeah, no, I think this is right. So I think there's always access to these treatments without any gatekeeping is an issue. Malaria specifically, there has been a lot of WHO effort to try prevent this. So even at pharmacies and so on, it's actually much harder nowadays to get unlicensed sources for treatment and so on. But yeah, I think the point stands. Any other questions? All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.